Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 19, Tony and Steve. The day after Asgard, Tony headed for his lab. Not without a bit of a discussion with Pepper. First, it must be said, she'd wanted him to help with the recovery effort more. Tony had pointed out that he really didn't need the publicity, and he did need to not only fix the Mark 6 so it was operable, he needed to build at least one new suit besides the Mark 7, because the 6 was going to be nothing more than a I am so fucked and all my other suits are dead, need something now, backup. Thankfully, Pepper knew him well enough to know that keeping him out of the lab made him rather cranky, so she didn't push. Tony grinned as he yanked on a thick black tank top and then an old faded AC/DC shirt, blanking out almost all of the glow from the reactor. Normally, he didn't wear the tank top, too, but there were relative strangers in his house. Tony could barely tolerate Pepper touching his chest most days. His chest, not the reactor. Not even she got to touch the reactor without him reacting. He'd kept the reactor covered and hidden as much as possible since Stain, unless he was in the suit. One of him realized he was being ridiculous. No one in the Avengers section of the tower was going to steal the reactor, for crying out loud. He knew that, but he kept it covered all the same. PTSD was a bitch, but he'd learned to deal. He'd re-engineered the reactor so that he could fix and replace it without assistance. He'd learned to avoid still the water issue by switching to bubble baths or showers only, and he made sure to keep his armor in place in public. Dummy was right on the other side of the lab door, clicking and worrying anxiously. Tony patted his claw. For all Tony's complaining about Dummy, Dummy had always been his favorite of the three bots, and that was before Dummy had saved his life. And as it turned out, not even simple AIs were completely immune to their equivalent of worry. Dummy had developed a habit, after the Stain incident, of checking Tony for visual damage anytime he was gone from the lab for any length of time. Tony was perfectly fine with being an enabler, so he moved far enough into the lab that Dummy could circle him and check him over. Once Dummy came to a stop in front of him, he patted Dummy's claw again. "I'm fine, Dummy. No damage. No scoop. We've got work to do." Dummy chirped happily and scooted off as fast as his wheels would let him. "He was more worried than usual," Jarvis said. "I was unable to prevent them being aware of the attack." Tony sighed. "Yeah, that didn't do it," he said. "All the replacement panels fabricated?" "Indeed, sir. Do you wish to begin with the repairs, or were you planning on working on developing a new armor first?" Tony headed where the Mark 6 was lying in sections on one of the larger workbenches. "Repair first, Jarvis. Playtime later. Run track 4 for me, will you?" "Of course, sir." And moments later, the lab speakers were blasting heavy metal at ear-bleeding levels. Tony grinned, grabbed a wrench, screwdriver, and a pair of pliers and went to work stripping the wrecked panels off. He'd gotten most of the wrecked panels off and was fighting with and cursing at the crumpled, twisted mess that was the right 4-hour gauntlet about an hour later. Several of the connections and joints that held the gauntlet panels to the rest of the suit had gotten crushed, making yanking them off particularly difficult. Dummy was hovering, endeavoring to be helpful and, as per normal, mostly getting in the way. He'd just snapped his finger on a jagged edge when the connection he'd been working on unexpectedly snapped out of his grasp when Jarvis interrupted him. "Sir, Captain Rogers is at the door and wishes to speak with you." Tony grumbled as he cleaned his hand enough to dab some skin glue on the cut so he could finish with the suit. "Let him in, Jarvis, and turn the music down." The door popped open and Rogers stuck his head in. "Not out saving kittens today, Cap?" Tony asked. "Pepper wanted one of us to stay just in case Ross tried something again today," Rogers told him. "So I volunteered. My being Army might help." Tony snorted. "Your being you will be what helps." It was only then he glanced over at Steve, who was staring around the room in interest. "You know, when you said lab, I was picturing something a lot different," Rogers said. Tony laughed. "Most people do," he agreed. "So you're down here... why?" "Curiosity. Fury's file on you was..." Steve's brow wrinkled. "Incomplete." Tony laughed. "Now there's a shocker. What do you want to know?" He wasn't quite ready for the question Steve asked. When Pepper had asked for someone to stay in the tower against Ross being an idiot, Steve jumped at the opportunity. For one, while he liked helping people, he still felt like a performing monkey doing so in the uniform, which Pepper's plan for positive media exposure sort of required that they do that, so they were recognizable as Avengers. Well, at least for everyone except Tony. Tony was recognizable enough to get away with not using the suit. Besides, he really wanted to talk to Tony. Of everyone in the group, he knew the least about Tony, thanks to Fury. Clint and Natasha were easy enough to figure out, even if he didn't know specifics. Snipers were snipers, even if they used unique weapons. It wasn't too hard to figure the sorts of missions Clint had been on. Same general idea for Natasha. Steve knew he was probably missing the magnitude of their ops by a margin, but he was at least in the general neighborhood. Bruce had been easy enough to look up to find stuff he'd published. As for Thor, well, Steve had read the Eddas. He was pretty sure a good chunk of it was nothing but tall tales, because he can't begin to see Thor doing some of it, but it gives him a base to work from, if nothing else. Tony? At this point, Steve's not willing to bet that what Fury put in Tony's file isn't a bunch of lies. So he's going to start from scratch. He headed down to the lab and walked in when the door opened. He blinked when he got in because this place was not a lab. At least not the sort of lab Steve was used to. This place bore a closer resemblance to a mechanic's garage. There were tools, grease, parts, and machinery everywhere. Steve could see a big bundle of parts that looked like it might be the Iron Man armor minus the red and gold exterior sitting on one big workbench. Tony was hunched over another workbench, cursing a blue streak at something that Steve couldn't see from this angle. He let Tony's playful-sounding jabs roll over him until he could finally ask the question he wanted the answer to the most. What happened in Afghanistan that changed things? He asked. For a moment, he wondered if he should have gone with something easier, because Tony went abruptly white as a sheet and sort of hunched in on himself. Darn, Tony, you don't have to answer that. I shouldn't have, Steve stammered. That seemed to make Tony rally. He uncurled a bit. It's fine, Cap, he said, a blatant lie if Steve had ever heard one. What makes you ask? And Steve recognized a stalling tactic when he heard it, but given Tony's reaction, he was going to go with it. I know what a man on a mission looks like, Steve said. The thing about missions is, something has to happen to get you on one. Being kidnapped isn't enough? Tony asked, his tone odd. Can be. But then why keep going? From what I've pieced together, you wiped out the people that took you within weeks of making the second suit. If it was just about the kicking their butts, you'd have quit then. Tony regarded him for several long moments. There was another guy there, he said, his tone quiet and strained. Jensen. He's the one that kept me alive. A drum of fingers over where Steve knew the arc reactor was illustrated how. He helped me build the first suit. Tony took a deep, shaky breath. He didn't make it out. Got shut up during the escape, trying to buy me time for the suit's computer to boot up. I found him before he died. He told me not to waste my life. Then Tony buried himself in fussing with the piece on the workbench he'd been cussing at. Steve let him go for a few minutes, let him get his feet back under him for a bit, sat down on a nearby bench to watch Tony work. Once Tony's motions became less spastic and his face and body lost some tension, Steve spoke up. The night before the procedure, Erskine and I talked, he said. He had a bottle of schnapps, planned to give me some to drink before he remembered alcohol before the procedure wasn't a good idea. Steve's mouth twisted. He told me why he'd chosen me for the procedure. He told me about the Red Skull and what had gone wrong. That the serum worked on what a person already was. His exact words were, good becomes great, bad becomes worse. Steve said, he made me promise to stay a good man, not a perfect soldier. The next day, when everything happened, he reminded me of the promise just before he died. Tony looked over at him, and the two of them shared a long look, recognizing that they both had a common factor in their lives. A mission they'd been put on by people who had seen the good in them. Then Tony gave his head a shake. Yeah, okay, whatever. We are not girls, Rogers. We are not sharing the moments of our lives here. If you're going to stay down here, make yourself useful and help me get this panel off. Steve laughed and pulled his seat over to the workbench. This part of the suit that Thor crunched? Tony nodded. Yeah, the arm gauntlet, which took the worst of it. Guy has a heck of a grip on him to do this to the suit. It's not exactly made of tin, Tony said. Steve peered at the panel that was apparently giving Tony so many problems and spotted where it was all but fused to 2 bits of metal that connected it to the rest of the suit. If I yank this off, the connections are going to come with it. That's fine, they have to be replaced anyway, Tony said. Steve nodded, got a grip on the piece, and gave it a yank. It came off in his hand with a short squeal of distressed metal. Tony promptly stole the piece from his fingers and tossed it in a nearby bin. Finally! Now I can get the connections fixed and replaced and then deal with the wiring. Steve wandered over to the remains of the suit and examined it curiously. He was surprised at the complexity of what the flashy exterior concealed. How the heck did you even come up with this? He asked. A familiarity with flight systems and a fuck ton of trial and error. Mostly error, Tony said with a wince that indicated a painful memory. Given what the Iron Man suit was capable of, Steve had little doubt that whatever had gone wrong had ended up being painful. About then, some thing on wheels came buzzing over and bumped at him. It took Steve a minute to realize it was some sort of machine. Your machine is poking at me, Tony. Tony glanced up, then laughed. That's Dummy. He was the first AI I built back when I was 17. He's just checking you out. I don't normally get a lot of visitors in here. Dummy, leave the man be. Dummy whirred and clicked in a way that Steve was sure was some sort of communication, circled Steve one last time, then rolled away. Sorry, he's a bit special, Tony said. His code's pretty limited. You built that when you were 17? Steve spitefully sputtered. Yep, Tony said, popping the P. That is... Steve shook his head, unable to articulate it. Really keen, he finally settled on, though it winced as he was aware of how dated such a phrasing probably sounded. Things went quiet for a while. Steve ended up plopping himself down in one of the extra chairs and just watching as Tony put the suit back together again. It was such a contrast to Tony's usual style elsewhere. Generally, Tony seemed incapable of keeping his mind focused on any one thing at a time and jumped from subject to subject when he talked with little rhyme or reason. Here, though, Steve was fairly sure that Tony had forgotten Steve was in the room, all his attention on the task before him. Eventually, Tony sat back with the air of a man who'd completed a task and done well. He wiped his hands on a rag, then turned. In the process, he spotted Steve and jumped about a foot off his chair. Jeez, Rogers, you're still here? Steve shrugged. Nothing better to do until Ross shows up, he said. Tony gave him a sideways look, like he didn't quite believe it, then shrugged and turned his attention away. All right, Jay, heat up the design program and let's get cracking. Seconds later, the air was full of blue light that coalesced into the outline of the suit, only at about quarter size. Steve did a double take in surprise. He'd seen all sorts of things since he'd woken up, but he'd had no idea they had technology that could project an image in the air. And then Tony started poking at the image, and it turned and expanded. Tony grabbed something and pulled it into his hand to examine it. Steve couldn't restrain a shocked gasp. It was... He could... How? Tony heard him and glanced over, then grinned. Oh, you haven't seen this before. You won't see it anywhere outside of the tower. It's only Jarvis that can do this. It takes a lot of computing power, and most people use that sort of power for other things. But it's real. You can touch it? Steve asked. Yes and no, Tony said, then waved him over. Come here. Here, hold your hand out, palm flat. Steve did so, and Tony put the piece he'd pulled out to examine on Steve's palm. There was no weight at all. No real sense of the thing's edges and dimensions, but there was a faint electric tingle against his skin that told him it was there. Oh, I see. So how do you... Manipulate it? Feel for the edges of the energy, Tony told him. Steve did so, and after a few moments managed to somewhat clumsily make it spin in place on his palm. The more you use the program, the easier it gets to manipulate things, Tony said. You get more sensitive to the buzz, right? Steve guessed. Tony nodded, and he stopped needing to feel around for the right spot. I've been doing this for years, which is why I can do things so easily. I can alter the design however I want and see how it goes with everything else immediately, instead of having to wait for production or take the time to make a mock-up of the piece in question. Steve grinned. This is incredible, Tony.